Close your eyes and let your mind drift as we journey into the darkest moment of Pokemon's creation. Picture a small office in Tokyo, the year somewhere around 1994, 4 years deep into what would become a 6-year development cycle. The air thick with cigarette smoke and the hum of Unix workstations. On the screen, flickers of data representing hundreds of creatures, towns, sprites, music files, everything that would eventually become Pokémon Red and Green. And then, without warning, the screen goes dark. The hard drive makes a sound like grinding metal. Everything stops. This is the story of how Junichi Masuda went through 4 computers making Pokémon, and how one catastrophic crash nearly erased the franchise before it could begin. When Junichi Masuda joined Game Freak in June of 1989, he was stepping into something that barely qualified as a company. Born on January 12, 1968 in Yokohama, Masuda had spent his formative years discovering the intersection of music and technology. In high school, he'd played trombone in the brass band while experimenting with a Korg MS-10 synthesizer at home, copying techno music from artists like Yellow Magic Orchestra and Ultravox. He studied computer graphics and C programming at Japan Electronics College in Shinjuku, Tokyo, using DEC professional workstations. When Satoshi, Tajiri, and Ken Sugimori officially incorporated Game Freak on April 26, 1989, transforming their gaming magazine into an actual development studio, they needed someone who could bridge the gap between code and composition. Masuda fit that description perfectly. But the reality of Game Freak in those early days was far from glamorous. The company had just released their first game, Quinty, known as Mendel Palace in North America, through Namco. It was a puzzle game where players flipped tiles to defeat enemies, and while it showed promise, it wasn't exactly setting the world on fire commercially. The team was tiny, just a handful of passionate individuals working in cramped quarters with minimal resources. There was no guaranteed paycheck, no safety net, no assurance that their next project would succeed. Every decision carried weight because failure could mean the end of everything they were building. Masuda's role from the beginning was multifaceted by necessity rather than choice. He wasn't just a composer or just a programmer. He was whatever Game Freak needed him to be on any given day. For Mendel Palace, he'd handled both programming tasks and created the game's soundtrack, learning on the job how to make the Nintendo Entertainment System's limited audio hardware sing. It was demanding work, the kind that required switching between completely different modes of thinking. One moment you're debugging code that controls sprite movement, the next you're composing a melody that needs to loop seamlessly for potentially hours without driving players insane. The financial situation at Game Freak during this period was precarious at best. While Tajiri had a vision for what would become Pokémon, taking shape in his mind around 1990, based on the Game Boy's link cable and his childhood memories of collecting insects, actually making that vision real required money the studio simply didn't have. So Game Freak did what many small developers did in that era. They took contract work from larger companies to keep the lights on. Their second game, Jerry Boy, came out in 1991. Then came Yoshi, developed for Nintendo in 1991, a falling block puzzle game featuring enemies from the Mario universe. This project was particularly significant because it marked Game Freak's first direct collaboration with Nintendo, and, critically, it was successful enough to generate profit that could be funneled into Pokémon's development. Masuda composed the entire soundtrack for Yoshi in just 6 months. The score was purely original, not arrangements of existing Mario music, which added pressure to deliver something that would fit Nintendo's standards while standing on its own merits. The success of Yoshi did something invaluable for Game Freak. It established trust with Nintendo, and perhaps more importantly, it let them hold on to Nintendo's development equipment for an extended period. Nintendo would check in occasionally, offer suggestions, like Shigeru Miyamoto's idea to release Pokémon on multiple cartridges, but there was no formal contract during those early years. Nintendo essentially said, as Masuda later recalled, "Okay, good luck. As long as you guys have money, keep working on it." This hands-off approach was both a blessing and a curse. The team had creative freedom, but they also had to figure everything out themselves. Then came Mario and Wario in 1993, another collaboration with Nintendo where Masuda again handled sound duties. These contract projects were lifelines, but they also meant that Pokémon development happened in the margins, during spare time, whenever team members weren't working on the jobs that actually paid the bills. Imagine trying to build something as complex and ambitious as Pokémon, while simultaneously juggling multiple other projects, each with their own deadlines and demands. The team members who wanted to work on Pokémon did so in whatever time they had left over, pouring their creative energy into implementing interesting ideas, building the foundation of something they believed could be special, even when nobody outside their small circle understood the vision. This brings us to the hardware they were using. For Pokémon's development, Game Freak was working on Sun Microsystems Spark Station 1 workstations, specifically referred to as Unix boxes in technical documentation. These machines were introduced in April 1989 and represented cutting-edge technology for the time. They came in distinctive pizza box-style enclosures, just 3 inches high, designed by Andy Bechtolsheim, with an emphasis on compact footprints. The Spark Station 1 featured a 20 MHz RISC processor, a YTEC floating point coprocessor, and could support up to 64 megabytes of memory through 4 banks of 30-pin SIMs. The basic display ran at 1152 by 900 resolution in 256 colors, which sounds primitive now but was impressive for 1989. Game Freak had acquired 4 or 5 of these Spark Station 1 units for their Pokémon development work. The machines cost between $8,995 and $15,400 depending on configuration, which in today's money translates to roughly $22,000 to $39,000 per unit. This was a massive investment for a small studio barely staying afloat financially, but these workstations were necessary because Pokémon wasn't being developed directly on Game Boy hardware. Instead, the team used these Unix machines to create assets, write code, compose music, design sprites, and manage all the interconnected systems that would eventually be compiled down to fit onto a tiny Game Boy cartridge with less than 1 megabyte of storage. The Spark Station 1 ran Sun OS, a Unix-based operating system that required a different approach to computing than most people were used to in the early 90s. Everything was command line heavy. Graphical interfaces existed, but were primitive. File management required understanding Unix directory structures and permissions. For a team that included artists and composers alongside programmers, this created a steep learning curve. But more problematically, these machines, for all their power and expense, had a critical weakness. They crashed, often. According to Masuda's own recollections shared in a 2018 interview with Polygon, the Spark Station workstations crashed quite a bit. Back then, computers would crash fairly frequently, he explained. This wasn't unusual for the era. Consumer-grade personal computers in the early 90s were notoriously unstable, and even high-end workstations like the Spark Station had their issues. But when you're developing something as complex as Pokémon, with hundreds of creature designs, multiple interconnected maps, battle systems, trading mechanics, and thousands of individual assets, even a single crash can be catastrophic. And as anyone who's worked in creative fields knows, it's not always about whether you lose data, it's about whether that loss happens at a critical juncture, at a moment when you can't afford the setback. Somewhere midway through development, around the 4th year mark, that nightmare scenario became reality. The team was deep into production, past the conceptual stage, beyond early prototypes. They had concrete progress, hundreds of Pokémon designed and programmed, the main character sprites, town layouts, battle mechanics, music tracks, sound effects, everything that would eventually ship in the game cartridges. All of this data lived on these Unix workstations, and all of it was suddenly at risk. The crash itself was catastrophic, not just a minor glitch that required a reboot, not a corrupted file that could be restored from a recent backup. This was, as Masuda described it, a really bad crash that they didn't know how to recover from. The computer that held all the game data simply wouldn't respond. The team tried standard recovery procedures, the kind of basic troubleshooting anyone might attempt when facing computer problems. Nothing worked. The data appeared to be completely inaccessible. For all they knew, 4 years of work had vanished in an instant. It really felt like, Masuda recalled, "Oh my god, if we can't recover this data, we're finished here." This wasn't hyperbole. Game Freak was already operating on razor-thin margins. 5 employees had quit during Pokémon's development because the studio couldn't guarantee stable employment. Satoshi Tajiri himself had stopped taking a salary, living off his father's income instead to keep the company afloat. They had no publisher contract in place, no guaranteed release date, no financial cushion to fall back on. If they lost 4 years of development work, there would be no starting over. The company would fold, Nintendo would move on to other projects. The Pokémon that existed in Tajiri's vision and in the team's collective imagination would remain trapped there, never materializing into the games that would eventually change everything. Masuda, despite being primarily a composer and sound designer by training, suddenly found himself taking the lead on solving this crisis. The company that had given him his start in game development, the one he'd worked for before joining Game Freak, became his first call. Did they have any advice, any technical expertise that could help recover data from a crashed Unix system? He reached out to everyone he could think of who might have relevant knowledge, but this was 994 or thereabouts, years before Google, before Stack Overflow, before the vast interconnected web of technical support that exists today. So Masuda turned to one of the few resources available for technical help in early 90s Japan, an online service called NiftyServe. This was essentially the Japanese equivalent of CompuServe, one of the major online services operating in Japan at the time. NiftyServe was launched by Nifty Corporation, a subsidiary of Fujitsu, and it provided dial-up access to forums, message boards, and technical support channels. Using a modem to connect, Masuda would go online and ask complete strangers for advice on how to recover data from a crashed Sun workstation. Picture the scene. In the middle of a crisis that could end Game Freak entirely, Masuda is staying up late, dialing into NiftyServe through a phone line, typing messages to people he's never met, hoping someone somewhere has encountered this exact problem before and knows how to fix it. The English manuals for the Spark station itself became another critical resource. Because these were imported American workstations, much of the detailed technical documentation was in English, not Japanese. There wasn't a lot of information, in Japanese, Masuda explained, just to figure it out. So he was reading through dense technical manuals in a foreign language, trying to decode instructions about file systems, Unix recovery procedures, hardware diagnostics, anything that might offer a clue about how to access the locked data. This was before machine translation, before easy access to bilingual technical support. It was just Masuda, the manuals, his English skills honed during his technical college education, and an increasingly desperate race against time. We don't know exactly how many days or weeks this recovery process took. Masuda's interviews don't provide that level of detail, but we do know that eventually, somehow, they figured it out. The data was recovered, the game files came back, Pokémon survived. But the psychological impact of that near miss, the knowledge that everything had almost disappeared, that moment became what Masuda described decades later as the most nerve-wracking moment in development, something that stayed with him after all these years. The question that naturally arises is, why wasn't there a backup? In modern software development, version control and regular backups are fundamental practices, so ingrained that not doing them seems almost incomprehensible. But in the early 90s, especially at small studios with limited resources, these practices weren't universal. Tape backup systems existed but were expensive. External hard drives weren't yet common. Cloud storage obviously didn't exist. And when you're a tiny company barely making payroll, juggling multiple projects just to survive, implementing robust backup systems might have seemed like a luxury they couldn't afford. A problem for tomorrow that kept getting pushed aside until suddenly it became a crisis. The computer crash was just one element of a larger pattern of struggles during Pokémon's 6-year development. The financial pressure never let up. Creatures Inc., which had grown out of the remains of Ape Inc., the developer behind Earthbound, eventually stepped in with additional funding to help Game Freak complete the project. In exchange, Creatures received a third of the franchise rights, joining Nintendo and Game Freak in the complex ownership structure that still exists today. This investment was crucial, a lifeline that let development continue, but it also meant that the potential success of Pokémon was now split 3 ways, reducing Game Freak's individual share of any profits. Meanwhile, Masuda was wearing an absurd number of hats. He wasn't just recovering crashed computers or composing music, he was programming. He created something called Sound Driver in the early 90s, a program specifically designed to play music and sound effects in Game Freak's titles. This tool became foundational for creating all of the original Pokémon cries, those distinctive calls that would become instantly recognizable to millions of players. Each Pokémon needed a unique cry, but the Game Boy's audio hardware was severely limited, offering just 4 channels total, 2 square wave channels, 1 wave pattern channel, and 1 noise channel. Creating 151 distinct cries within these constraints was like composing a symphony using only 4 instruments, and 3 of them can barely play melodies. Masuda had to get creative, layering simple waveforms, adjusting pitch and duration, adding noise elements to create the illusion of variety and complexity. Some cries were slightly modified versions of others, a necessity given memory constraints. Raiden, Gengar, and Kangaskhan, for example, shared recycled sound cries that were just pitched up or down slightly. Most fans never noticed, which was exactly the point. The limitations forced efficiency, and that efficiency paradoxically resulted in a more cohesive audio identity for the games. The music composition for Pokémon Red and Green was entirely Masuda's work. Every town theme, every battle track, every route melody, the Pokémon Center jingle that would become one of the most comforting sounds in gaming, all of it came from Masuda working within the Game Boy's extreme technical limitations. He'd been inspired by classical composers like Igor Stravinsky and Dmitri Shostakovich during high school, but the music in Pokémon needed to be lighthearted and accessible, the opposite of Stravinsky's heavy, experimental works. The Game Boy's sound chip forced him towards simplicity, short looping melodies that wouldn't drive players insane during extended play sessions. The Lavender Town theme, for instance, uses unusual musical scales that gave the area its eerie, unsettling atmosphere, becoming the source of countless urban legends years later. That wasn't an accident. Masuda understood how sound design shapes emotional memories. The development timeline for Pokémon stretched to 6 years, from roughly 1990 to 1996. During this period, Masuda and the rest of the Game Freak team were essentially living a double life. During business hours, they worked on contract projects for Nintendo and other companies, the jobs that paid the bills. But their passion project, Pokémon, consumed their spare time, their evenings, their weekends. It's the kind of schedule that burns people out, and indeed 5 employees did quit during this period, unable to sustain the pace or lacking faith that Pokémon would ever actually succeed. Tajiri not taking a salary became legendary within Game Freak's history. He believed in Pokémon that much, was willing to sacrifice his own financial stability, dependent on his father's support, all to keep the project alive. This kind of dedication either inspires a team or creates resentment, and fortunately for Pokémon, it seems to have been the former. The teamwork-focused work style that developed during this period, where everyone contributed ideas and skills across traditional role boundaries, became part of Game Freak's culture going forward, as Masuda noted in later interviews. When Pokémon Red and Green finally released in Japan on February 27, 1996, nobody really knew if it would succeed. The Game Boy was considered to be in decline at that point. Nintendo's handheld had been around since 1989, and by 1996 it was showing its age. New, more powerful handheld systems were on the horizon, but Tajiri and Miyamoto had discussed this concern, and they decided to take the chance anyway. The link cable, the trading mechanic, the social element of collecting creatures and sharing them with friends, these weren't features that required cutting-edge hardware. They required imagination and execution. The games became sleeper hits, not overnight sensations, but steady performers that built momentum through word of mouth. By 1998, when Pokémon arrived in North America and Europe, that momentum had built into a tidal wave that became known as Pokémania. The anime, the trading card game, the merchandise, all of it exploded into a global phenomenon that dominated popular culture. School attendance dropped on days when Pokémon movies premiered. Teachers confiscated trading cards. Parents struggled to find Pikachu toys during holiday shopping seasons. The franchise that had almost died in a computer crash became one of the highest-grossing media franchises of all time. For Masuda, the experience of nearly losing everything shaped his approach to game development going forward. In Pokémon Gold and Silver, he took on more responsibility, becoming sub-director while continuing to compose music. He was joined by Go Ichinose in the sound department, allowing the team to create new songs more quickly. By Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire in 2002, Masuda had become the full director, taking over from Tajiri, who stepped back into more of an advisory role. This transition marked a significant shift in Game Freak's structure, with Masuda becoming the public face and creative lead for the franchise. His directorial philosophy, influenced by those difficult early years, emphasized accessibility. Every Pokémon game should start simple enough that a beginner can pick it up and understand the basics, then gradually introduce more complex systems as players progress. This approach came directly from watching children play during Pokémon's development and understanding that the game needed to welcome newcomers while still offering depth for experienced players. He also insisted on handheld development, believing that portable systems enabled a type of social interaction that home consoles couldn't replicate. The Game Boy, and later the DS and 3DS, allowed players to carry their Pokémon with them, to trade in school hallways, to battle during lunch breaks, to share the experience in physical space with friends. The story of Masuda going through 4 computers isn't explicitly detailed beyond the major crash incident, but context suggests the number refers to the multiple Spark Station failures the team experienced during those 6 years, plus possibly other hardware issues with the development Game Boys themselves. The Unix boxes crashed quite a bit, as Masuda said, meaning the catastrophic data loss was just the worst example of an ongoing problem. Each crash represented lost time, disrupted workflow, the anxiety of not knowing if this time the recovery would be successful. In the years since, Masuda's story has become a cautionary tale in the game development industry. The importance of proper backup systems, of version control, of not putting all your data on a single machine without redundancy. These seem obvious now, but had to be learned through painful experience. The fact that Pokémon survived its near-death moment is as much about luck as it is about Masuda's determination and problem-solving abilities. If that English manual hadn't contained the right information, if the stranger on Nifty Serve hadn't known the solution, if the data had been corrupted beyond recovery, we'd be living in a world without Pokémon, or at least a world where it arrived years later in a much different form. Masuda continued to direct Pokémon games through Pokémon Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee in 2018, though he stated those would likely be his last time serving as director for main series games, passing the torch to Shigeru Omori. He remained involved in various capacities, including as director for Pokémon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl developed by ILCA. In 2022, Masuda left Game Freak entirely to become Chief Creative Fellow at the Pokémon Company, a role that lets him influence the broader franchise beyond just the games. The leaked Game Freak documents from 2024, part of what became known as the Terra Leak, revealed internal struggles during Masuda's later tenure, describing an era of absolute dominance where he handled everything from development planning to personnel decisions, public relations, and game design. Apparently, this concentration of power led to organizational issues, with the documents claiming that various problems arose, including favoritism and a shift from fun-focused design to PR-driven content. During the development of Pokémon X and Y, Masuda allegedly got into an argument with Ken Sugimori that resulted in him being banned from directing future games. Whether this characterization is accurate or exaggerated is difficult to verify, but it suggests that the pressures of leading such a massive franchise took their toll even on someone as experienced and dedicated as Masuda. But that's a story for another time, because what matters most about Masuda's journey isn't the power struggles or the eventual corporate politics. It's what happened in that small Tokyo office in 994 or so, when a computer crashed and threatened to erase everything. It's Masuda staying up late, reading English manuals, asking strangers on dial-up bulletin boards for help, refusing to accept that 4 years of work could simply vanish. It's the entire Game Freak team, barely scraping by financially, pouring their spare time into a game about catching creatures because they believed it could be something special. Technology has changed dramatically since those days. The Sun Spark Station 1 that cost $15,000 in 1990 had less computing power than a modern smartphone. Cloud backups are automatic. Version control is free and universal. Losing data the way Game Freak almost lost Pokémon is now almost impossible through a combination of redundancy and better engineering. But the human element, the dedication and perseverance required to see a creative vision through years of struggle and setbacks, that hasn't changed at all. Every time you hear that Pokémon Center jingle, every time you boot up a Pokémon game and hear those opening notes of the title theme, you're hearing music that almost didn't exist. Every Pokémon you've caught, every battle you've fought, every friend you've traded with, all of it traces back to that moment when Junichi Masuda, composer and programmer, faced a crashed computer and refused to let it be the end. The melodies he created under such constraints and pressure became the soundtrack to millions of childhoods worldwide. The sounds he synthesized from 4 audio channels became as recognizable as any pop song. The game he helped save from technical disaster became one of the most successful entertainment franchises in history. So the next time you're facing a seemingly insurmountable technical problem, or a creative project that keeps hitting roadblocks, or a dream that seems impossible because the odds are stacked against you, remember Junichi Masuda and those crashed Unix workstations. Remember that Pokémon, this global phenomenon worth billions of dollars, this franchise that brings joy to people across every continent, almost ended in a moment of hardware failure. And remember that sometimes the difference between success and oblivion is just one person who refuses to give up, who reads the manuals, who asks for help, who keeps trying until they figure it out. If you enjoyed learning about the hidden struggles behind Pokémon's creation, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are countless stories like this buried in gaming history, moments when everything hung by a thread, when dedication and luck intersected to create something that would outlast the people who made it. Sweet dreams, and may your computers never crash at critical moments.